Guys, Jeremy here with Simple Little Life. Today we're going to do something that I've been wanting to do for well over a year, and that is to turn this old air compressor into an offset smoker.
Now, right off the bat, I will let you know that I've never made an offset smoker before. I did quite a bit of research, but this is all just kind of shooting from the hip. No plans, just a vague idea of what I think I'm going to do. But the first thing we need is to get rid of all the components that make this compressor a compressor. All we're really after is the tank. And once all the mechanical bits are gone, then we need to take off any unnecessary metal brackets and clean this thing up so we've got a nice blank canvas to start with. I'd like to thank Princess Auto for sponsoring this video. A lot of the tools I used in this video were from Princess Auto, as well as the air compressor that replaced this one came from Princess Auto. So thank you, Princess Auto, for your sponsorship. I really do appreciate it. Once we had all the metal brackets off, trying to be careful not to get into the tank too much, we need to remove the paint. And for that, I used this scraper paint remover disc. I went through 2 of these, and this probably took me about 2 hours. It was not a fun process at all. These decals were gumming up my disc, so I ended up just taking a heat gun and a scraper to them, and that made fairly quick work. Once we got those removed, back to more sanding. Looks fun, doesn't it? Alright, now it's time to lay out the door. So there were 2 bungs on the side of this compressor, and I decided to leave them there. And those became my benchmark that I worked from. I could level off of them, and I made that the very top of the smoker. So for the top of the door, I went 2 inches down, used a 36-inch ruler, a couple of mag switch magnets, and drew out my first line. And this is a 20-inch diameter, so I just went 10 inches up, and that gave me the center line of the tank. And you'll notice this little magnet there. I had 4 of them on either side of the tank, and magnetic sawhorses. That helped stabilize this thing so it didn't move while I was doing all my layout. Now before we go ahead and cut this door out, I want to make the hinges and get them welded on. And for the hinges, I'm using 1/4-inch steel plate. These are actually extra slats from the gate of our property, so that's kind of neat. And I jumped into Fusion 360 and drew out a little design that I thought would work. I had the 20-inch diameter on the inside so it would match the radius. I 3D printed these, and that way I could verify that they would fit in the locations and that they were the right radius, the right arch. And then I need 6 of them, so go ahead and cut them out on the bandsaw. Once that's done, we just clean them up in the grinder. If I were to build another smoker, I would probably have a lot of these parts laser cut, especially considering the fact that I drew these in Fusion 360, so essentially I had everything I needed to send it to a laser cutter. But for this project, I just wanted to keep it very hands-on, and I would have had to do a lot of future planning to have stuff laser cut, and this was not a future plan thing. This was like 1 step at a time. Let's deal with the step when we get there, and so pretty much had to do everything the old school way. Yeah, I'm fine by that. Once we had them all profiled, I clamped them together so we could drill them all at the same time, using a 1/4-inch pilot bit first. And once we've drilled through, then I'll drill each one individually to 1/2 inch, as we'll be using a 1/2 inch bolt for the hinge. Now before I install the hinges, I need to cut out the lid that will be underneath the hinge area. That won't be available once I weld the hinges on, so just making a couple 3-inch cuts where the hinges are going to be welded. We'll weld the hinges in place, and then we can cut the lid out. I'm using the welds on the end of the tank as a reference from one side to the other. It's not the most accurate, but for this, it's definitely going to be good enough. And I opted to go with 2 of those hinge plates on the tank itself and 1 on the door. I'm really hoping that hinge plate will help keep the radius of the door when I cut it open. And with everything welded in place, we can go ahead and start cutting out the door. The next step I figure I should take is making the base frame, and for that I'm just using 1.5 inch square tubing. I'm making this 19 inches wide, so it'll be a little narrower than the overall diameter of the tank. And I'm basically welding this whole thing together, and then grinding the top and the bottom flat. The top obviously will have the supports that will go up to the tank, and then in the bottom I'll weld some plates that I could bolt casters to. And for the upper support legs, I will be using 1.5 inch square tubing as well. And I also did a little 3D design to help match the angle that I needed. So I made up this little template, printed it out. It took me but a few moments in Fusion 360. And that way I could set that on the edge of the tubing, run it right to the top, make sure it's flush, and scribe in a line there. And that line should be the exact same line that this will intersect with the tank at. I tell you, having a 3D printer, situations like this, it has just made such a huge difference in my process in my shop. I really, really enjoy it. And we'll cut these out with the bandsaw, get it fairly close to the line, and then clean it up with the grinder. Before I weld the uprights, I thought I should weld these plates on the bottom. So we're just going to go ahead and tack those on, then run some full welds as much as we can without interfering with the holes. And then we will very carefully weld on these legs that will support the tank. If you've done welding like this, you know how as soon as you run a bead on one side, it pulls it toward that side as it cools. So these are a little bit tricky, but if you take your time, pay attention, and don't do too much welding in the beginning on one side or the other, you can get them pretty straight. This one came out really, really nice. And to make working on this a little easier, I thought we may as well put the casters on right now before we put the tank on. That way we can just easily maneuver this underneath the tank while we lift it up with a forklift. The bolts that I had were too long. It wouldn't allow the casters to fully swivel, so I ended up cutting those off. I also ended up switching out 2 of these casters. These are all 4 locking and swiveling. I ended up putting 2 fixed casters on the one side just because it made steering a lot easier. I was really impressed with how this sat on there. Those arms didn't really push out too much at all, and it was actually very, very level. I did verify that the floor that I was building on was level, and once I checked everything out, I started tacking it together. Now, this one side did sink a little bit low, so I just used this bar, pulled it together, and it kind of lifted the tank up at that one end just to get me level, and then we can weld her up. Alright, now that we had this thing on wheels, it was time to try to clean out the inside of this tank. As you know, air compressors, they cause a lot of condensation. That causes rust, and even with the oil inside the tanks, there's a lot of gunk buildup. So my first step was to take it to the old pressure washer and do as much as we could with that. And you can just see how nasty that water coming out of that drain hole is. I was careful to make sure that I could dispose of it. Whoa, there goes a level. That level's compromised. But yeah, it was incredible how much sludge came out of this tank. And even after all that pressure washing with hot water, there's still some of the sludge that just wouldn't drain. And this was like a nasty, oily, rusty sludge. Oh, it was bad. I was actually a little concerned at this point because that smell inside that tank was so strong. If you've ever smelled that air compressor water smell, you know the smell I'm talking about. And I was really worried that that might flavor the food. And so I thought, man, we need to do whatever it takes to get the smell out of this tank. I ended up going through 4 cans of brake cleaner. I tried that. The smell was still there. So then we wheeled this thing outside, spent some time with an angle grinder, and the smell was still there. What could I do? What could I do? Well, I thought, you know what? Let's try sandblasting. So I went to Princess Auto, picked up one of these gravity-fed portable sandblast units. This thing worked really, really well. A lot of nice volume there. Just dump the sand in top, hook up your air line, and just have at her. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that I spent 5 hours sandblasting the inside of this tank. Every square inch, every square centimeter got sandblasted. That was a very spiteful job, but it worked. That's what matters. It worked. Obviously, I didn't film all 5 hours of it because that'd be boring. I've heard of yards that you can go to do sandblasting, and next time I'd probably opt for something like that. This made a huge mess that I had to clean up, and on top of that, I had sand everywhere. Everywhere you could ever imagine, there was sand. I was glad I only had to do this process once. But with the tank pretty much prepped, it was time to move on to the firebox. Now, this was the most expensive part of the project. I bought this 3/16 inch thick 4-foot by 8-foot steel plate, and this was enough to get my whole firebox built, as well as a few other accoutrements for the project. I'm using one of these circular saws with a metal cutting blade in it. This is specific for cutting steel, and it worked absolutely fantastic. This was my dad's saw. I just bought a new blade for it because his was shot. And this is how I cut up all of my steel plates. The box I'm making with an outside dimension of 20 inches by 20 inches by 20 inches. I want it to match and be flush with the outside of the tank. And I am doing something a little different on this one. We'll get to that in a minute, but there was an awful lot of cutting with this saw. And a lot of welding on this project too. And with all the plates cut out, it was time to tack them together. Trying to be very careful, keep everything even. And also trying to put a bunch of small tacks in various places so they don't cause warping before everything is fused together. And after I had finished welding this whole thing together, I was really surprised and quite excited that every plate was still flat and true. And it just kind of goes to a testament that it's important to spend your time tacking things together before you go and start laying some hot and heavy welds. Now, I'm a fan of overbuilding things, ook 'em skook 'em, and so I did full welds on the outside, and then I did full welds on the inside. I did end up grinding the outside welds down just to round them over, make it look really nice. And that's part of the reason why I did full inside welds as well. And now I've just put 2 pieces of 1.5 inch thick bar stock or whatever to give me an 1.5 inch space for this plate. I'm going to put 2 of these in, and these are going to be insulating walls for the front and the back of the firebox, meaning the front will be where the person cooking will stand, and then the opposite wall of that. I just thought it might help make this a little bit more efficient, and also maybe a little safer if there's children walking by it or something like that. But this is the insulation I'm using. This is ceramic wool, and this stuff is pretty dangerous. You need to be careful when you're handling it. You don't want to breathe any of those fibers. You can see when I'm dropping it in here, some of those fibers come off, and I made sure I vacuumed those up right away. You know, when they say be careful of something, that it's dangerous, it's best just to trust them, use your PPE, and don't be a hero. And then after that, we're pretty much ready to weld on the top. Now, before I welded the top, I actually chamfered the whole thing with this new chamfering tool that I got from Princess Auto. Here's the before. Take this little tool. It's basically like a router for steel, and it leaves a nice chamfer that you can get your weld into. And here's what it looks like. It works absolutely fantastic. So we'll weld on this plate and then jump on the door. So for the door, I opted to use my plasma cutter. This is the Pro Point something 45, I think. I don't know, it's a plasma cutter I got from Princess Auto. I've had this for quite a while. And I'm cutting the first part of the door that will be under the hinge. Again, just like the top, I want to get the hinge welded before I completely cut open this door. That way I don't have to worry about alignment or anything like that. This is just some heavy-duty piano-type hinge I got from Princess Auto, and I drilled a few holes in it, that way I could plug weld it, and then just a couple stitches around the outside. And after we get that thing welded, we can cut out the rest of the door. One little trick I did here is I'm using those mag switch magnets and a square, and that's a really quick, easy way to give yourself a guide that you can rest the edge of your plasma cutter against. It worked really well. Quick little deburring, and now that we had access to the inside, we need to put one more weld on each of the plates that sealed in the ceramic wool. Then we're making a little flange that's going to go around the door just to help seal it up. All right, we're going to put the firebox aside for the moment, and we're going to work on the opening that's going to receive the firebox. So I figured out this would be a fairly quick way to go. I just used a laser level, put it right centered line. That's where I'm putting the opening for this, and then I just used a little shim. And again, leaning against that weld, I just marked my lines out. Now this was a part of the process that I was starting to get really excited. I went from having a tank and a box, first time moving them together, and it started to look like an offset smoker. I was getting really, really excited at this point.
Oh my goodness, that is a nice fit. It's got a great fit right there. Great fit right there. This is way at a level, and once it comes back down to level, that cap should close. But I'm just going to trace this opening for the fire hole. We'll cut this out, and then we're going to weld it on. Probably attach it here at the legs as well. Let's trace this out, see how it goes. Right, so I did this one. I think that might be a little too low.
Now, I'm not sure what the firebox weighed at this point, but I would guess 100 pounds, a little bit. It was definitely heavy lugging this thing around and flipping it over. But the next step will be to cut the throat, which is the opening between the firebox and the cook chamber. And that was pretty much it. This thing can be welded to the chamber, and man, it feels like we're making progress. Now onto the opposite end of the smoker, we need to work on the collector and the stack pipe, the exhaust. So this was a piece of 1/4 inch thick, 5-inch inside diameter steel pipe that was laying out in the field. Very rusted, full of dirt, but use the old paper trick so we can get a nice straight line on there. And then I just used a portable bandsaw to cut this. And then once we have this cut up, we can go on to making the collector box. Now, the reason I used this pipe was because it was free. It was laying out in the field and I didn't have to pay for it. I was trying to do this whole build as inexpensively as possible. The most expensive part was the 3/16 steel plate, and that was $285. And believe it or not, the entire budget for this build, this thing cost less than 500 Canadian pesos. I was pretty stoked to be able to do it with that kind of frugalness. So for the plates of the collector on the top and the bottom, I wanted that radius to match the radius of the tank. And so I measured a line 2 inches up because the collector is going to be 4 inches tall. And I thought this was a genius idea because I could just use that as a template to plasma cut the top and bottom plates. As it turns out, the end cap that I cut off here is actually of a different radius than the other end of the smoker. So I had to make a few adjustments, but it was fairly close, and this did work quite well. And here you can see the difference in the radius. Oh well, we'll go to the belt grinder, take some off the ends. I'll be good to go. So I made the top and bottom plate for the collector, and here you can kind of see how it comes together. Now we just need to measure out these sidewalls for it. We'll get that tacked in, and then trace this out onto the tank so I can get a more accurate representation of where I need to cut. And we're going to end up notching this pipe, so I'm just making my marks as to where that needs to happen. This is the time when it'd be nice to have a proper fixture table, but again, using those mag switches on my welding bench and then one on the tank, I was able to clumsily finagle this into place, giving it a few quick tacks, just so it'll hold that there, and then I can trace the inside of the opening. One thing I never showed is that you notice the side plates have a slight radius to them. That was just so I wouldn't have huge gaps to try to mess with. And here I'm just putting a few clocking marks so that when I go to put this on, after I cut it off, I can get it back in the exact same place. Now this was a close call. Unfortunately, I bent the door a little bit. I ended up trying to straighten the door, and it kind of worked. It's not as good as it was before it fell over, but we learned from our mistakes. Well, try to, I guess. The one thing is that this was a much more convenient position to work in, so I guess it was a bit of a happy accident. And once I get everything in the cook chamber and the smokestack on, it should balance itself out quite a bit better than it is right here. And my plasma electrode ended up burning out, and I didn't have any extras on hand, so I just finished this cut with the zip disc. Don't ever pick a fight with an angle grinder. You pretty much lose every time. Thankfully, that wasn't that bad. And this is actually a rubber-backed grinding disc. It's not like hard abrasive or anything like that. It did end up kind of wrecking the disc, but I'm just glad I wasn't injured. Also glad I had my safety glasses on. Now before I weld the collector to the tank, I'm going to fully weld this thing up, and then I did it off camera, but I ground all those welds nice and smooth and round. And back to our happy accident. This was actually a really comfortable position to weld this collector on. And we'll have a quick look at the gaps that we're dealing with. They're pretty good. Ended up getting some pretty nice heavy welds in there. Now, if the comment hasn't been left already, I'll admit, I'm the first one to admit that I'm not the world's greatest welder. The thing I struggle the most with is running really long, continuous beads. I find it hard to get comfortable and in a way that I can move along, so I generally do about 2 to 3 inch welds at a time. So with the collector sitting in there, now we need to go ahead and cut it out in those lines that we had laid out. We're going to clean off the rust, and then we'll get this sucker welded on.
It's a smoker.
You bet it is. Now, with most of the externals done, we're going to focus on the internals. So these are some supports I'm putting in, just some angle iron. I think this is 1/4 inch by 1 inch angle iron. Just welding that in there. We're going to make a tray out of the same material. And we'll just cut some notches in here so we can join these corners up. This is one of the easier ways I find to join angle iron at a 90 degree. We'll go ahead and weld this frame up and then see how it fits. I also welded angle iron around the opening on the top and bottom of the door. And there's a little bit of a lip there, so I need to grind that down a touch.
All right, so this thing is kind of sprung open a little bit. And so it's grown a little long and it doesn't match the curve there. And I think that this thing helped this top half of the lid stay in line. So this is going to be the handle we're going to use, and I 3D printed this, and again I've got the 20-inch diameter right there. So we're going to go clamp that tight, which will bring this in to its original shape, and then we'll get that welded on there. But first I need to take this template, trace it to this 3/8 steel flat bar, and cut it all out.
And I saved you all the bore of having to watch that. What I ended up doing was drilling 5/16 holes in here and then counterboring to 5/8. This is a little piece of 5/8 shafting that I'll drill and tap for 5/16, and that way it'll be like a little sort of a plug hinge over a piece of pipe for the handle. That way the handle will be removable. It won't be easy to remove, but if I did want to get it off in the future, I certainly could do that. It took quite a bit of clamping force to get this door to spring back to its original shape, but that did a good job. I scribed out a couple lines as to where I wanted it located, then welded it in place, and that actually did a really good job at bringing this back to its original radius. And then we jumped over to the other side, put our piece of pipe in between, and welded that half of the handle on. Now the center part and the bottom right there, that was still kind of wowed out. You can almost see it. And so I ended up making a couple of ribs, again with a 20-inch diameter. And again, 3D printing them, tracing it out, cutting out the steel pieces, and welding those on. Now we're going to put some expanded metal over our tray, get that all welded up. And while I was cutting and welding the expanded metal, I cut out a little piece for the bottom of the legs here, and that will be a spot for storing wood. Now I'm working on the damper, and so I want a little flap at the top of the smokestack that I can open and close so I can control the airflow. So I ended up cutting a circle out of the corner of a piece of steel, leaving it in a teardrop shape, and I just use that pipe as the radius. That'll be the top of it. This is going to be the handle, and all I really need is a 90-degree bend in here. So this is 5/8 steel rod. We'll bend that up, and we'll stick this in 2 pieces of pipe, weld the pipe to the smokestack, and then weld this rod to that damper plate. And it should work pretty good. So I wanted that guide pipe to be right flush with the very top of the smokestack. And so I drilled this hole, had the shaft sticking proud of it, and I just welded that up. And as you can see, it works really well. And just like we did on the door for the firebox, I'm putting a lip, a little edge around this opening. And this was just a matter of chasing clamps around with my welder. I didn't want to put too much heat into this because I didn't want to affect the curvature, like make this radius expand or anything. So basically I'm just doing little tacks as I go. And once both sides were done, I just did one on the bottom of the lid there. And again, this is welded to the lid. At the top, I tried tacking it on there, but it interfered as the door opened. And I think that was due to the fact that my hinges were so low. The pivot point was so close to the actual joint. So I ended up having to notch a smaller piece of steel and welding it to the tank so that the lid actually slips underneath it for the top part of the lid. Now back to the tray, I decided to make 2 tabs that would bolt to this frame. And essentially it's just 2 little L's that come off the back of the tray. That way when I slide it out towards me, it has something to catch onto on the bottom of the angle iron. All right, we're getting super close to the last few details. I put a little handle on that tray, and here I'm just marking out where I want my thermometers to be. I'm putting one at each end of the cook chamber, just so you can see the difference. And I put that so it ends up at about 2.5 inches above the grate. I figure that's probably a decent area for, if you got a thick brisket or something not so thick. We can always change this if we need to, but I think this should work. Now, one concern I had was that using the 3/16 inch plate for the firebox, a lot of folks say that the thinner material will kind of deteriorate as it's right next to the hot coals. But going from 3/16 to a 1/4 inch steel plate was going to be an increase of $500. So what I decided to try out, and I'm hoping this isn't a mistake, is that I'm just going to line the bottom of this firebox with fire bricks. And here we go. Let's test this sucker out. First time ever using a offset smoker. Really didn't know what to expect, but it works like it's supposed to. They just kind of move air through the cooker. In the beginning here, I did it off camera, but I ended up taking this fire and then I took a leaf blower and I got the internal temperature of the cooker up to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. and super stoked that it didn't smell like air compressor. One thing I didn't show is those angle iron that I welded in. That's where I can slide in a water tray. And the nice thing with that is that I don't have to have the water tray sitting on my cooking grate. It's about 1 inch off, so I can open and close that without interference. All right, so I ended up taking this thing up to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit, and then I sprayed oil on the inside. Right now, we're holding about 275. For now, I'm just using the crack in the door to regulate airflow and temperature, smoking with some cherry, and then with this top not being insulated, I can put the splits on there and it'll really get them really nice and dry so that they go from here into there. They light up right away, less smoke. I've got the damper wide open, and right now we are doing a whole chicken. It's just about done. This thing is working really, really well. We'll see how it tastes though. It tasted so good, and I apologize that once we got the bird off of here, I didn't have the patience to film carving it up, but it was the juiciest whole chicken I've ever had in my life, and I'm absolutely thrilled with how this thing cooks. Throughout the cook, it was about a 2-hour, 15-minute cook, and this thing held 275 very consistently. Add wood as you need it, adjust this as you need it. Having said that, I think I'm going to add louvers to this door, like the slots, so I can open and close them. I'll add a latch here so I can keep this locked up and then just fine tune my airflow. I think that's gonna be a better way to go, especially if it's windy or something. I know a lot of guys do the little notches, but I think I'm gonna try some type of a louver system. That will be a change I make. I'm also gonna be swapping out the wheels. These are great for in the shop, but as soon as I head out onto the asphalt, it kind of starts to shimmy shake a little bit. They also look really cool when you have like those golf cart wheels, so I'm most likely going to be adding that to this with some steering. And then the final thing I might do to this, only after I've had about good 10 or 15 cooks on it, is I might actually paint it. I found a really cool color. I'm not going to share it because I think this is going to look amazing, but I might do it. I found a paint that's 1200 degrees Fahrenheit it's rated for, and so that would likely happen. Obviously, I wouldn't paint the top of this because putting wood on here, drying it out, it's going to get scratched anyways. But I am really, really happy with how this turned out. This cooked a lot easier than I thought it would, and it was so predictable. It wasn't up and down and up and down. I mean, once I had a decent fire started, I'd let my temperature kind of settle where I want it using this, and then put the food on, and it just stayed that way. I'd noticed it slightly going down, add another log or two, and it was just, I'm pleasantly surprised at how easy it was to cook with this thing, and such a fun project. I want to thank Princess Auto for sponsoring this video, for making this, for helping make this a reality. You know, to use fabrication skills to build a smoker, a barbecue, that is some serious satisfaction. And then you eat the food afterwards. Oh, this is gonna be a fantastic summer. Super stoked about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any comments or questions about this, just leave them in the comment section below. I'll do my best to answer them. And we'll see you in the next video. Cheers. I like you. You're my friend. Oh, another real cool thing is that when this is in my shop, after one cook, it smells like barbecue. Like when you're in this vicinity, it smells like you're in a barbecue restaurant. So that's a win.